All right, here we go with our fourth part, and I don't know how many we're going to do, but we're just going to finish Romans, and so maybe there'll be three or four more of these. I don't know. We'll see. Even that'll still be less than our lecture time. So we're right in the middle of the argument in Romans chapter 9. Now, here's something very interesting. Did Paul just argue that God chose Jacob instead of Esau based on nothing in them, not on foreseen merit, just based on his will? And doesn't that seem unfair? Why did he choose to love Jacob and withdraw his love, or not withdraw, withhold his love from Esau? Isn't that unjust? And that's the question Paul asks in verse 14. So I must be interpreting this right? Is there injustice with God then? What should we say? Uh, and he says, absolutely not. And then he gives us the reason for, if you were tracing this, right, he gives the reason. And what's the reason? He says, absolutely not, because God's choice is based on the free will of Jacob over against the free will of Esau. Jacob chose to follow God, and Esau didn't. Oh, wait a minute. That's not what the text says, right? That's not what the text says. We want to pay attention to the text. No, God's not unjust because he shows mercy to whom he shows mercy. Quoting from the golden calf incident in Exodus 32, and he has compassion on whom I have compassion. Notice the singulars there. Very clearly here talking about salvation. So his argument is no one deserves God's saving, covenant, electing love. Isn't that remarkable? Esau doesn't deserve it. You don't deserve it. I don't deserve it. It's mercy. It's mercy. We have no claim. We have no claim on the grace of God, on the mercy of God in choosing us. We have no right to it because we're sinners. We deserve God's wrath. So it's God's mercy that saves anyone. It's a gift. Maybe the reason we're not always so grateful for salvation is we've forgotten that it's mercy. So Paul tells us it doesn't depend on the human will or effort. Isn't that remarkable? Our salvation ultimately, finally, doesn't depend on free choice or human effort. It depends on the grace of God. So many people say, don't they, that salvation depends on our free will. But Paul denies that very thing in verse 16 of chapter 9. Yes, we need to choose to repent and believe. We need to do that. But we only repent and believe if God grants us the grace to do so. So the ultimate reality is God's electing grace, the God who shows us mercy. Yes, he even hardens those who resist him, like Pharaoh. God shows mercy to whom he wills, and saving some, and he hardens whom he wills, like Pharaoh. So that's a very difficult word. So we come to chapter 9, verse 19. You will say to me, therefore, why then does he still find fault? For who can resist his will? I want you to notice again that I think I'm interpreting this correctly, because if ultimately whether one is shown mercy or one is hardened depends on God, then we're going to ask the question Paul asks here. Isn't that unfair? Aren't we puppets? Who can resist God's will? So that's what Paul's saying here. And what's his answer? His answer is, of course it's fair, because you misunderstand me. It actually does depend upon free will. I mean, come on. I'm not that fatalistic about things. Well, actually, again, that's not what Paul says, right? Paul does not give the answer we'd expect. Instead, he pulls the authority trip, doesn't he? Who are you to talk back to God? Well, what does form say to the one who formed it? Why did you make me like this? Doesn't the potter have the right to do what he wants with the clay? Isn't God sovereignly in control of what happens? Now, remember, as we saw in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul's not Paul's not responding to a humble question, how can this be so? A humble, compliant question. But if someone were to say, oh, and I've heard people say this kind of thing, oh, I can't worship a God like that. I'll have nothing to do with a God who does this sort of thing. If someone were to say that, Paul says, who do you think you are? You little finite, pea-brained human being. Who do you think you are to tell the master of the universe, the sovereign God, who do you think you are to tell him how to run the universe? God does what he wishes. And finally, I think there are some good explanations, not ultimate explanations about the problem of evil. But finally, when we come to these matters, and there's a mystery here, isn't there? We don't fully grasp it. But finally, what we need is not an intellectual answer, although that'd be helpful. But finally, what we need is God himself. When Job is struggling with why he's suffering so much, if you read the book of Job, God doesn't give him a nice, neat little packaged answer. God basically tells him in chapters 38 through 41, who do you think you are to question my justice? I'm running the world, thank you. Are you helping mountain goats give birth? Do you help the morning get going every day? Are you in control of the storms of this world, the snow and the cold? Can you control the horse and so forth and so on? Look, Job, let me run the world. You just trust me. You just trust me. And the other thing we can say as Christians, of course, we've seen in Jesus Christ that God enters our suffering. That our God has taken on flesh. Our God knows what it's like to be human. He's not separated from us. So God has his reasons as a sovereign God. Human choices aren't a charade, are they? But God has his reasons. God has his purposes for suffering. And one of his purposes in making the world the way he has is to display his wrath and to make his power known. And when we see the punishment we deserve, then verse 23, the mercy we deserve is all the sweeter. So if we really feel in our hearts that we deserve judgment, then the mercy God has shown us will be so much more precious to us. So you see how this fits into the argument? Will God's promises to the Jews be fulfilled? Absolutely, they'll be fulfilled because they depend upon his sovereignty. No one ever frustrates God's purposes. But then notice in the rest of chapter 9, Paul says that God has called not just the Jews, but the Gentiles. The Gentiles now, quoting from Hosea, the Gentiles now are part of the restored Israel. They're part of the new Israel now. So God's calling is of both Jew and Gentile into his people. And if he'd left the Jews without mercy, they would have been like Sodom and Gomorrah. But he's left a remnant in this present time. The next major section is from chapter 9, verse 30 to chapter 10, verse 21. And this is the other side of it, isn't it? Paul also argues that the Jews did not experience salvation because they refused to believe, because they trusted in their own righteousness, because they relied on their own obedience, but they fell short, because they didn't put their faith in Jesus Christ crucified and risen. So don't ever think that if you emphasize divine sovereignty and divine election, that it cancels out human choices. That's absolutely not true. We see that in Acts 2:23. Paul holds those who crucified Christ responsible for doing it, and yet he says it was predestined by God. We see the same thing here. It's all over the Bible, isn't it? God predestines who will be saved, but people must believe and should believe they're not puppets. So that's I think where the mystery is. Human choices are still significant, and they matter, and they're not thrown away. They are significant, and yet God is sovereign. So he indicts the Jews for for establishing their own righteousness, for trusting in themselves instead of the message of Jesus Christ crucified and risen. Well, that's the end of the fourth one. I'll pick it up again shortly.